All right, thank you, sir. Okay, so chapters 19 through 21 today. So for those who've been listening, or those of you who have been attending, we just got done with actually the first section of the book, the first half, book one. Now we're starting book two, and this is where the book is going to become more focused. So far in the book, it's mostly been a lot of chaos. The characters have been paragons. The way I like to visualize the structure of this book is it's almost like a narrowing spiral. So it starts out with these broad circles, but then as the book goes on, it becomes more focused. And now we're being introduced to the character Margarita, who is the master's lover. And all three of these chapters are going to be specifically her story. So time-wise, this chapter takes place at the exact same time as everything else has been happening in every other setting. So it takes place the day after the black magic show that the devil put on in Moscow. And the narrator starts out this chapter refuting an argument. And the narrator says, "The master thinks there is no such thing as true faithful love, but I tell you, I will show you such a love." And is then going to proceed to tell us the story of Margarita. FYI, her name is another reference to Goethe's Faust, because Bulgakov really liked that story, so that's another Faust reference for those who care about that kind of thing. So we meet Margarita in chapter 19. So she's 30 years old, she's extremely intelligent, she's pretty, she's rich, and at least she's rich compared to most people in the Soviet Union because she has all of her material needs provided for by her husband, which is more than can be said for most people in that regime.
Oh.
Yes.
The bathtub scene.
What are you referring to?
When he runs in and grabs the wedding candle. And
Oh.
paper icon. Is that her?
No, not that we're aware.
Okay.
No, not quite. But it is true though that there is another bathtub scene coming. But it's in reference to something different. The thing is, though, she's not really happy with her husband. She's childless as well. And this is kind of loosely based on Elena, Bulgakov's third wife, because she was also unhappily married when she met Bulgakov, hence one of the reasons she left to be with him. But one of the differences, Elena actually had, I think, 2 boys with her husband. This fictional woman has nothing as far as children go. So there is an elaborate story of how her and the master met in chapter 13. So to refresh on that, I would just encourage you to go back to chapter 13. But it was a rather brief but also kind of complex encounter in the street, very random, which also Bulgakov and Elena also met randomly in the street as well. So that's another self-write-in by the author. But point being, Margarita is kind of obsessed with this guy that she met, and she had a relationship with the master, and she was editing his books for him, and she really admired his work. And when she's away from him, all she can do is think about him. And this is also, it says in the book, it says, we find out here that she is mad at herself for leaving him when they met, and she's desperate to find out whether he's even still alive. And in one sense, this is a reference to him burning his own novel, which was referenced in chapter 13. Yes?
Is the master the devil?
No. The master he's a nameless protagonist in this story. He's an author. The devil in this story is named Voland. Yes. And she's still very much attached to his work. It says she felt in despair like Matthew Levi at the cross, which, for those of you who weren't here, there's a subverted version of the gospel that the devil has been propagating in this story. Yeah, which is something that the Soviets would do, and a lot of oppressive regimes would try to rewrite history. Mm-hmm. So the devil's trying to do that with the gospel in this story. Wow. There's that. But he ended up burning the novel because in both Bulgakov, the author, and the fictional character in the story, which is his self-writing, they both end up burning their novels about Christ and Pontius Pilate because you can't publish that in the Soviet Union. It would have been censored. So there's a lot of historical parallels in the story to his actual biography. So one night she has a dream where the master and she sees the master and she interprets this as a sign that he is dead, and therefore she doesn't really feel like living anymore, or that he's alive and she's supposed to go find her. We are told that she keeps a photo of the master hidden in her drawer along with some dried rose petals and a burnt copy of his novel. When the Margarita goes out for a walk, her maid Natasha informs her that it was a crazy magic show the day prior, and this kind of kindles Margarita's curiosity. So when she's out and about, she hears gossip about a weird mystical events happening in the city, and also a scandal about the head of a corpse being stolen, which is the head of a character who previously died via decapitation, and the Berlioz. So the way she is reacting to these things actually kind of clues us in about her character. She's very curious. She's very inquisitive, but she's also kind of obsessed, like with the master. So when she sits down on a park bench, she is joined by a weird stranger who is the demon Azazelo or Azazel, and he starts a conversation with her, and he's mentioning Berlioz, the man who was decapitated in, I think it was chapter 3, and how he worked for the Masalit Society, which are the Society of Soviet Writers who were paid by the state. And Margarita really hates them because they were the critics that kind of drug her boyfriend's work through the mud. So, so Azazelo addresses Margarita by her name, and this kind of irks her because she's thinking, how do you know my name? And so she's sensing kind of like a supernatural presence here. Furthermore, he tells her that a very distinguished foreigner wants her company in the evening, which she took offense at. And when she got up to leave, Azazelo quotes a passage from the master's novel that she knows. And he's basically using this as bait to set up a deal with her. And very much like Faust, that old story. So now Margarita demands to know if the master is still alive. And Azazelo affirms that he is, but if she wants to see him, then she will have to take a deal with him. And she has to meet with the foreigner. So Azazelo gives her a gold box with a special substance in it, and he tells her to apply this substance on herself 9:30 that night. This is part of the bargain. And she actually enthusiastically agrees because she thinks this will lead her to the master. And because of the dream that she had earlier that day, she interprets this as the fulfillment of that dream. So throughout the book, we see people entering into deals with demons, and it usually always goes wrong for them. They usually always end up getting exposed in some way or manner. But at this point in the narrative, a lot of the mayhem that we've seen previously in the book has subsided, and now we're much more focused in this next 2 chapters on the Margarita. Okay, so chapter 20 rolls around. And this chapter begins where Margarita is back in her room, and she's doing what Azazelo told her to do, which is to apply this cream to herself. And when she does, she finds out it makes her look really, really young. And she's not even that old. She's like 30, but it makes her look even younger, and it makes her skin glow, and it makes her super pretty. And yeah. Well, side note, actually. So, and we know this, Bulgakov based Azazelo on Azazel, specifically out of the Book of Enoch. And Azazelo is the demon in the Book of Enoch that corrupted women by showing them how to make themselves more beautiful. So this trope of his, he ripped straight out of that apocryphal Book of Enoch. So just as a side note. Now, the substance also makes her feel more energetic and lively. So she can kind of float around now. She can fly. She and she ends up leaving a note to her husband saying, quote, "Forgive me, I've become a witch from all the grief. I'm leaving forever." So ironically, yeah, so basically the cream, it's turning her into a witch, basically. So now, knowing Azazel was about to call, which was part of the deal, Margarita gives all of her material possessions to her maid, Natasha, who was amazed at Margarita's new appearance. So this is kind of a subversive way of leaving the world, if you will. She's leaving her old life behind. She's giving away all her possessions, but it's for all the wrong reasons. So when she gets the call from Azazel to take off to meet this foreigner, a broom flies into the window, and she takes the broom, she jumps on, and then she flies away. Now, as she's okay, so then chapter 21 it's called the flight. So this is her experience on this broom. So now, as she's flying invisibly around on this broom all around Moscow, she comes across the Dremlet house, which is where the Masalit writers are. Now, one of the master's most ruthless critics was a critic named Latunsky, and he is held up in this house. As stated previously, she really hates him for the way that he treated the master's work, so she has an opportunity now to take revenge for him. So she flies, so she goes into the house, and she realizes that he's not there because he's at Berlioz's funeral. So she wrecks his house by breaking things with a hammer, cutting up the bed sheets with a knife, and flooding the place with the bathwater. And when Latunsky's neighbors hear all of this happening, they run up to see what the commotion is all about, and she flies out the window, and she breaks somebody else's window in the process, actually, and she actually sees a terrified little kid peeking his head through a window of another apartment, and she actually goes to console him, and she tells him, "Don't worry, it's all a bad dream, you don't have to be scared," and everything. So this is kind of showing that even though she's kind of entered into this deal with the devil, she still has some degree of humanity left in her, so she still does care about children. And so now she flies away from the city. This is kind of a symbolic effort by Bulgakov to show how she has escaped the old life and the confines of the Soviet Union via the devil's power. So this is a very nuanced approach to the way this Antichrist works in this story. Like, yes, he might get you out of an oppressive system, but at the same time, you're kind of jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire, so to speak. So as she's flying, she unexpectedly is accompanied by Natasha, who was her old maid, and she also ended up using the rest of the cream to make herself the way Margarita is now. Now, Margarita's neighbor, who was mentioned in chapter 19, he walked in and saw Natasha and her beautiful appearance. And by the way, this guy is another one of these bureaucrats that works for the state. He's basically a cog in the machine for the Soviet Union. When he walked in and saw Natasha like that, his immediate instinct was just, he just wants to treat her like a prostitute and pay her to sleep with him. And what Natasha ended up doing was she applied some of the cream to him, and he turned into a pig. So she now, and then that pig ends up being like her steed instead of a broom. So it's pretty trippy, and we can get into that analysis. Yes, he's a flying giant hog, as the story says. Yeah.
Right.
Yep. Bulgakov was creative.
It sounds like
I feel like a cherry with Rams would have been slightly better.
Well, there's some folklore that's attached to as well that we can get into a little later. So when she lands on the outskirts of the city, she takes a swim in a lake, and shortly thereafter she kind of runs into a random drunken man who addresses her as Queen Margaret. So she's now being addressed as a queen since she's taken this deal. This is indicative of what she signed up for in taking the deal with Azazel. So she then notices a ceremony taking place at a distance, and she approaches with curiosity, only to find out that the ceremony is a ceremony for her. And there are naiads there, there are satyrs there, there's witches there. Bulgakov is kind of folding all of these mythological pagan creatures into demonology, into this like satanic outing, which is there to welcome Margarita for making the deal. So that's, and then the way this chapter ends is one of the satyrs walks up to her, and he asks her, he says, "How'd you get here?" And she says, "I flew on a broom." And he says, "You flew on a broom? How inconvenient. Here, let me summon a ride for you." And he takes a stick, turns it into a phone, calls a flying car, and then the flying car comes in, and then he says, "All right, the boss wants to see you." So then the flying car takes her back to Moscow, where she's basically going to meet Satan. So that's where this chapter leaves off.
He's always sleeps. He always falls asleep.
Okay.
It's not.
Well, it's not you.
All right. So, this is where the discussion starts. Are there any immediate thoughts about this before we just systematically work through this? Any thoughts on the character of Margarita herself?
Well, it kind of sounds like a lot of women today who are, not that they're flying over us, but like,
But she didn't waste no time becoming a witch.
they'll do anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's
Get what
interesting.
they want.
Yeah.
Pretty much. I mean, as far as even, answering to the devil,
Mm-hmm.
which makes me think of all the cream makes me think of all the commercials, all the promises that we hear today.
Sure. Yeah. And what I liked about that chapter too was how the demon kind of entices her by honing in on what she wants most of all, which is the master.
Mm-hmm.
Like they'll leverage whatever they can, but it also makes me wonder too if the dream she had, like earlier in the chapter, that kind of urged her to say, "Okay, I have to know if he's alive or dead."
Mm-hmm.
Part of that makes me wonder if that was just pre-list to set her up for this deal that was coming later.
Because where do dreams come from? As the fathers say, usually dreams are to be ignored.
All of them?
By and large.
Really? Some of them are like, I don't know.
Yeah, usually they say ignore dreams. If a dream occurs 3 times, or how does that go? I don't know. Ask your spiritual father.
Yeah, I was told by Father Theodosius that it's like whatever happens while you're praying, ignore it. If God really wants you to have it, He'll give it back to you, or something like that. I think I heard some story from a monk one time where it says even if an angel comes to your window and knocks on it while you're praying, don't answer it. Finish your prayers first,
Wow.
Yeah.
because you just never know it. It could be a setup. Who knows?
Yeah. As we talked about the other night, there are other things that float in your window very much lead you to open the window.
Yes. Yeah, a note I had about the character of Margarita is they build her up to be a rather firm character. Like she doesn't get phased very easily. So when she's out there hearing this gossip about how somebody's head got stolen, it doesn't really faze her. When this stranger sits down and says, "Hey, you should meet this awesome foreigner," and she misinterpreted that to think that she was being treated like a prostitute, she got up and tried to walk away. Like nothing really phases her. She seems to be well put together, except when it comes to the master. As soon as someone brings up the master, it's like all her rationality, all her reason, all her guards go down. And the demons played off of that. So that's one note that I had for chapter 1. Yeah, and also one thing I should let you know as well is everybody who's entered into a deal with a demon in this book so far has always came back just embarrassed, humiliated, or dead. or deranged. Like they all end up in the psych ward. There was a motif in one of the last chapters that we went through where all these naturalists, because like one of the tropes in this book is all of these supernatural occurrences are happening. The devil is just having a field day in Moscow because no one believes in him, and every time even the slightest thing someone says could get them in a lot of trouble. So, for example, in the last chapter, there was one of the devil's minions, Behemoth, a cat, goes into an office, and the CEO in the office says, "Get out of here, or devil take me." Just casually says that, and the devil says, or then the cat says, "Okay, that could be arranged." And then the man disappears, and then his secretary looks in the office, and all she sees is an empty suit doing paperwork. Yeah, which is also another way that Bulgakov is blending his satire for the Soviet Union with the way the devil interacts with it. Saying like an empty suit doing paperwork is a perfect analogy for a cog in the machine, or just kind of a busybody for the Soviet Union. But also he's saying like, no, the devil's behind this too.
Yeah, it's like a lot of things happening today.
Yes, very much so.
Just sure if you can figure it out.
Is it the white one?
Here.
Yeah, it's easy to figure out.
It's supposed to.
You got it?
Did you put it on?
I think it takes a minute. They have similar things like that in Greece.
It's on?
It might be, I don't know.
Maybe it just takes a second. Well, Jay said it's easy to figure out. Let him figure it out.
Here. Just like communism is filled with so many empty promises.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of parallels there.
He's weaving the setting and the events together quite masterfully.
That's scary.
Mm-hmm.
They're sort of cross. It's sort of a cross satire between the two, actually. Using the Soviet Union to showcase the devil, and then using the devil to showcase the Soviet Union. It's like, like the way that he makes his deals are, yes, like classically Faustian, but they're a tongue-in-cheek joke.
Yes, he bends the fabric of the Soviet Union to hilarious results in many cases. I mean, some of this book is satire, it is comic macabre. Some of it is genuinely funny, but it's kind of supposed to it's absurdist humor. It's supposed to just kind of show how just utterly insane all of this is. Like when you bring it down to reality.
Yeah, when was it written?
In the 1930s, under Stalin. Needless to say, this book didn't get published until the 70s. Yeah, there was an abridged version that was published, I think, under Khrushchev in the 60s. But the full version didn't come out till the 70s because it's too offensive. So additionally, though, this chapter where Margarita makes a deal with Azazelo, were there any thoughts on the concept of how this is basically an inversion of submission to evil? Because while the guys were talking about their experience on Athos yesterday, it's all about how like the monks they completely leave the world, they give up everything, they take vows of poverty, they own nothing, they're fully consecrated. Whereas with something like this, and what we see also in other folklore, is that people will do the same thing for the devil, which is very interesting. They'll give up everything, and in this case, she gave up everything. And the imagery in the book really kind of digs into this, where it's like as she's flying away from the city, it's growing smaller and smaller because her past life is reaching its vanishing point, and also the other thing too is she's invisible while she's flying around on this broom, but she's also not wearing any clothes. She even left all her clothes behind, and she was going to. She gave all of her clothes to Natasha, and so there's that also that imagery of stripping away everything of her world, scaling all the way down to the very clothes on her back. So in a way, she's becoming like almost fully consecrated to the devil. And when we look at witch folklore, this is exactly what they would do in their rituals. We can actually get into some of those a little later, if anybody wants, or well, now if there's any questions about that.
A lot of actors and musicians, they literally do that. They sign their, right?
Yeah.
Sign,
Yeah.
Um,
Supposedly they sell their souls to the
sell
devil.
their souls to the devil. And I don't know if you're familiar with Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
He did that.
Really, I didn't know that.
Yes.
Well, he almost implies it.
He almost
There's
implied
an interview where he kind of says a higher power, but
Mhm.
not a higher power.
And yeah, the guy interviewing him was asking him questions, and he had his head down. He was like, oh, you know. And then the guy asked him, I forgot what he asked him, the interviewer.
But he said that there was, like, I don't know how much you know about Dylan, but his, like, he came into so much
Fame?
like his 4 albums in a row,
So
like,
fast.
he became very popular,
So
and
fast.
he was very creative, and he kind of says it's because he made a pact with someone.
And then, yeah, the guy asked him, how did you move so fast from A to B? And he just was like, you know.
Hmm.
He goes, no, I don't. What do I? He goes, you know. You know what it is. Just,
Yeah, I didn't know that about Bob Dylan. I know the Beatles were into some really weird stuff. Their whole slogan was, well, I don't know if it was their slogan, but one thing they did say in an interview was, they said, yeah, our whole philosophy is just do as thou wilt, which is straight out of the Book of Thelema.
do without what?
Do as thou wilt. Basically, do whatever you want. You're your own God. You know, no blessed obedience. You're totally free. Do whatever you want. And yeah, they skyrocketed too. So there is an interesting pattern. Some say, now, I don't think he actually did this, but some say Paganini actually sold his soul to the devil.
Who?
Paganini, Niccolo Paganini, the famous violin player of the Renaissance era. Yeah, because he could play abnormally well, but he also had a deformity in his left hand, which allowed him to like bend his wrist in ways that normal people couldn't. So he could play the violin in ways that normal people couldn't. But that trope he was accused of that. But the reason I bring that up is because that trope was even around back then, and like in past ages. It goes back too to like this trope about demons teaching people things that they're not supposed to know yet. And I know you're familiar with this trope. Like it's
Like what? Like an example now? Like how could...
AI.
Here's a scary thing. We got off, we were there, but I mean, I kind of thought about it afterwards. Get off the plane, and you go to the custom officer. He makes you take your glasses off. Does a picture, but he's getting your retina. And I think
You're right.
he gets your retina. I think instead of having like stopping people, he presses a button, and they'll just watch that person walk because they just once they got your retina, that's kind of scary because all those people are all over, and we just left, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They stopped Vasily because he looked like a terrorist.
No. Is that what they said? No.
Well, he says it. He says he's dark. He's got the
No. It was because what did he say? I think they thought he had substances on him.
They thought he had substance.
Yeah. I don't know, but those substances were theological books in Greek.
Oh.
But that's what's scary. That it's like AI. All they have to do now is take a picture of your retina, have cameras around them, and they don't have to have a person follow them. All they have to do is hit like a security number, and they'll trace that person till he's out of the place. That's amazing. I mean,
Yeah. Well, in China, it's even like all they need is your face.
yeah.
They have facial recognition built into all the street cameras and everything, so everything that happens in the public is record. They actually came out and said those exact words. It's very very dystopian. It's kind of scary. Yeah.
It is scary. We don't have any freedom anymore.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, but there's that trope though is like if like I read Enoch like 4 years ago. It's not in our Bible, but it is an important book for the church because it contains a lot of true teachings about just the way that the Second Temple Jews conceptualized the way reality works and how the spiritual reality works. And even in Genesis 3, the way that the devil tempts Adam and Eve is he says, you'll have this knowledge and you'll become like God. So he tempts them with knowledge. And when they eat the fruit, they all of a sudden get all this knowledge that they're not ready for. And then they get expelled from paradise. And what the Second Temple Jews realized is that the demons do the same trick throughout the ages, where they give people knowledge that they're not supposed to have, and then they use it to destroy themselves. So in Enoch, the demons come down, the fallen angels come down, they teach people how to make weapons, they teach them how to wage war, and they teach the women how to basically objectify themselves. They teach them how to wear makeup and all that stuff, and
Wow.
and that's exactly what we see here
Is that
with...
from Enoch now?
Yeah, it's from Enoch.
Wow, see, I never read Enoch.
Yeah. And in this book, first thing, Azazel, the demon of Enoch, who teaches women how to wear makeup, first thing he does is he gives Margarita a box of special cream that makes her look 10 years younger.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah, women like that.
Well, I think the internet's doing pretty well teaching us how to do things.
mhm.
I said the internet
Yeah,
is
the
like
internet.
the knowledge.
Yeah,
It's teaching us to do lots of things.
yeah. It really is, in a way, it can be too much. It's almost like we have to use our own discipline to monitor ourselves so that we don't fall into that trap. So,
Well, one of the monks,
mhm.
Father Lazarus, he had an old phone. He said, I got rid of my other phone because it's too much distraction. He can text his family and call his family, but he doesn't have internet.
Jay, would you be
But
kind
one
of
of the
close
monks,
the door?
he's a young monk. What? Yeah,
Is the door all the way shut?
he's a young monk at Gregoria.
Thank you. So yeah, Father Lazarus, you said?
Father Lazarus, yeah.
Okay.
Was he like 33, I think? Yeah.
And what did he say?
Well, he has a regular phone.
Okay.
And he
Like
said,
a flip phone.
yeah, he has no internet.
No
He said, I
internet.
got rid of it because it was too much distraction. Because they're allowed to have phones. They're allowed. He has a blessing to stay in touch with his family. He can call his family whenever he wants.
Well, that's good to know.
Well, one thing I wanted to touch on too here is when we see this demonic gathering out in the wild. What's interesting is like, okay, so Bulgakov, he was raised Orthodox, and then his father died, and he went through a faith crisis. It started doing all kinds of weird, crazy things. Like he started going to seances. He started getting into some weird demonic stuff, and then in World War I he was wounded, and then he treated his pain with morphine, and then he got addicted to morphine, and while he was addicted to morphine, he had all kinds of demonic experiences with hallucinations or whatever, and so he kind of knows how these things work. And one thing that he's talking about when he mentions these specific creatures in the specific gathering, he mentions satyrs, and he mentions kind of like these water nymphs, or and
Dryads.
or not dryads. I wrote the name down. Naiads.
What are they?
Okay, so naiads are kind of like in Greek mythology. They are these water spirits, and they're usually not a big deal. They're not like sirens or anything. That's something different. But they sometimes will bless people to drink the water, but it's like they need to have a special blessing to go swimming in the water. And some people in ancient Greek or ancient Greece would pray to these creatures for water, for crops, that kind of thing. So they're a pagan creature, but the interesting thing about the Russian naiads, they are known as Rusalki, and there is some folklore in Russia that these are the souls of unbaptized children that are jealous of those who can go to heaven. So sometimes they will try to drown people. There's also other folklore that says that these were women who died before puberty, so they never got a chance to have children, and their soul. And by the way, this has never been Christian doctrine. This is just like leftover folklore.
Twisted, yeah.
Yeah, it's like leftover folklore that got mixed in with Christianity.
Well, you know how the Catholic Church, I remember when I was going to Catholic school, 1st grade, 2nd grade, they said that if a baby dies before they're baptized, they go to limbo.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What's limbo?
Well, the last pope said there is no limbo, so
But what is limbo?
I don't know. They don't have
They
it
didn't
anymore.
explain what it is.
Well, I believe that, gosh, it was either Augustine or Anselm. I think it was Anselm who tried to soften up Augustine's alleged position about how unbaptized babies go straight to hell. Maybe it was Augustine. Gosh, I wish it's been like 3 years. But either Augustine or Anselm basically said that unbaptized babies do go to some degree of hell, but they're put higher up above the flames so they don't like burn and torment. So that's like the little babies go to the sauna in a way. Yeah, but there's other lore where they dwell on Earth, and then they have like certain. They were sometimes sought after by people who wanted to get in contact with the devil because these things had died. These people had died, but they're still here, which means they kind of have access to the other realm. Mm-hmm. So they have powers to do magical rituals and all that stuff. So it makes sense that Bulgakov would put them in his story to do these magical rituals because he's mixing in this folklore with this story, which is still, even in the Soviet Union, is a gutsy move because the Soviet Union banned everything. Like, they pretty much banned anything they couldn't control. It was a system of complete control. So anything that kind of ventured outside of that, they wanted to get rid of. Like, you couldn't even do karate in the Soviet Union because it was deemed too foreign. The other creature, too, that he puts in there are these satyrs. And a satyr is kind of like a half man, half goat thing.
Yeah.
Oh, I've seen that.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting is I've heard some. I didn't hear it online, okay, but I heard some critiques of C.S. Lewis actually, where he's bringing in these animals and these creatures into Narnia that are like Mr. Tumnus is kind of like, they call him a faun. He's like half man, half goat. And some say that C.S. Lewis didn't really look far enough into what these creatures actually were before he included them in his children's story, which I guess could be a fair critique. I wouldn't really side on one. I wouldn't really take a side on it, but
They're associated with Pan, aren't they?
Pan?
With Pan and the Greek god Pan and wild drunken parties.
They're associated with Dionysius, who is kind of the Greek version of Bacchus, except the Romans kind of took Dionysius and they stripped him down to like his most base components, and that became Bacchus, which is like a god of hedonism, which also makes sense why these creatures would be here in this gathering as well. And also in other Russian folklore, the devil has been portrayed as a goat man, and the attendants of Dionysius, at least according to ancient Greek mythology. Now, they were complete and total hedonists, and symbolically the way that works is it's like their lower half, like their lower parts, are just completely driven by irrational animal instinct, but they're also still partially human, so it's kind of like an image of a human being that's synergized with temptation.
Yeah.
And the fulfillment of temptation.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So, and they were actually also they were part of Greek dramas as well. I mean, there's only two surviving. One of them is Cyclops by Euripides. Uh, so if you're curious about that, there's that. But witch folklore too in Russia goes back. Believe it or not, the whole witch riding around on a broom thing that actually only goes back 500 years. That's a relatively new trope, but Bulgakov implemented it anyway. And yeah. But were there any other? I think the service is about to start in like 7 minutes. So were there any closing thoughts on this before we say a prayer to the Panagia? Questions, comments, criticisms of the book? Anything at all?
I think you need to have as much knowledge as you do of a lot of folklore and Greek. I have no, I'm like, I'd be lost. I'd be reading, it'd be interesting, but you have a lot of insight into why.
Well, this is a weird book, and I'm actually surprised because I didn't pick the book. Actually, it got voted in, so I put it on there as an option. Everybody voted for this book, and I'm thinking, okay, people are in for a ride, because there's some weird stuff that kind of needs to be disentangled to really understand and enjoy the book.
It kind of reminds me of between like screw tape letters, like something like that, and Harry Potter kind of.
Something like that.
Yeah, no, I definitely thought of the screw tape letters comparison as well. I'm actually glad you brought that up because I think that's a very, very fair way of how he's narrating the story. Because even though he's not, some parts of it are straight up from the perspective of the devil. So that is very screw tape letters like. But then there's other parts that are from the perspective of different characters. So it's a very... This was actually listed in the top 100 novels of the 20th century.
I mean, it sounds like an interesting book, but I probably wouldn't understand it as I'm reading it. So.
Well, that's why we do it together. That's why we have discussion groups
No,
and all that.
you're very knowledgeable. I don't know anything about that.
No, people have interesting opinions. Like I brought a vampire expert in here 2 weeks ago to extrapolate some of this stuff for us, and she did great.
Really?
So
You brought a vampire expert.
yes,
Friend of his.
a friend of mine. Yeah,
Are you serious?
yeah, she's Orthodox, but she's done a whole bunch of research on vampire folklore in Eastern Europe, and she knows how it's like intertwined with like the Eastern European church and all that. So
Really?
yeah, that recording is on the thread.
Wow.
So
See, I don't even know what a thread is.
and the Telegram thread.
Terrible. Oh,
You're on Telegram for your woman's group, but you probably don't even know how to get
I
on.
don't know. I don't know.
So
All right, well, we'll wrap up. We'll say a prayer to the Panagia, and then we'll head upstairs.